Welcome, everyone, to our Future Mind series. Today is a conversation between Alison Liebling and Àlex Gómez-Marín. Alison Liebling is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Cambridge and the director of the Institute for Criminology's Prison Research Center. She has carried out research on life in prison for over 30 years. Her projects have included suicide and self-harm in prisons, close supervision centers for difficult prisoners, incentives and earned privileges, and a host of other topics. Àlex Gómez-Marín is a Spanish physicist turned neuroscientist. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics and a master's in biophysics from the University of Barcelona. He's also the director of the Parry Center, and I will hand the discussion over to Àlex now.
All right. Thank you, Michael, and welcome everyone after what it feels like a summer break. At least I had one, and it felt good to be in the mountains and swimming in the river. All right. Thank you, Alison, for accepting our invitation. It's great to have you here.
Good to be here. Thank you very much, Àlex.
Yeah. Alison and I met last year in Paris, actually, and I found your work fascinating. I mean, I'm interested in everything, but in your case, as it will be evident in a moment, it's not just a topic. Is that you, as I understand, you're an academic that study things that matter in the real world. Because some of our work is very interesting, but then one wonders, well, what good is that doing to actual people in the actual world? And when I heard about not only what you think through and write, but also when you go to prisons and you talk to people there and you try to help them in a way, well, that was kind of the perfect, as I see, both triangles, one that's going down from the abstract world and another one that's coming up from the real world. And so I'm really looking forward to learning more about it with my curious, naive questions. Where to start? Well, look, I thought we could start like this. You're writing a book, you're finishing a book, and you sent me an outline, and you wrote, and that was very captivating. You wrote that this book is a kind of protest about forgetting what is fundamentally human in organizational life, and it's about a deep human regard. So what is that thing that we are forgetting? And we have time to unfold it, right? So
yeah,
let's go with that.
Okay, so we're forgetting the human. I mean, that's the starting point, and it's why I've called the book A Search for Humanity and Justice. And I suppose the conditions of coming to write it were to do with coming to the end of quite a long series of projects, and one in particular that led me to a bit of a crisis. And it was about returning to a prison. I was asked to return to a prison 10 years or 11 years after I'd studied it before. And the first time I studied it, it was always my favorite study. It was in a good place. It was a nice research project. I was looking at the work of prison officers when they were doing it particularly well. It was in a very sort of professional state. And so that was a really good project. And then I was asked to go back 11 years later in very different circumstances, and the prison was unrecognizable. And I'd never expected to go back and repeat a study that I'd done already. And it was for very particular reasons. And just the experience of going back, somebody described the book I'm writing as a long footnote to that experience of going back and finding a prison paralyzed and violent and newly inhuman. And in that 11-year period, lots of things had happened in the world, but I was seeing the consequences in a very kind of serious way. So I suppose one of the things I've done is both compare prisons over time, but also compare them with each other. And the contrast was just so extreme. It was kind of unfinished business. It was a very uncomfortable project. We found it really difficult to navigate. We were a team of 3. And the language I now use is that it was like there was a fog in the prison. It was like someone had turned the lights off. And the first time, there was good lighting. And that meant people could navigate their way. Staff knew who prisoners were, prisoners knew who each other were, and the place was reasonably ordered. But this second time, it was really paralyzed, and it left me in sort of shock, partly because it was so extreme, but also because what I saw the second time was almost like a concentrated version of what I think is going on outside. There are changes in the world, and those changes are damaging the light we live in. We're going from light to dark, and that's having really serious consequences. And so it wasn't straight away, but it took me a while and some other research first, sort of trying to play with this problem before I realized I needed to step back. I wanted to stop doing research and think and digest and sort of find my way through this mystery.
So you're saying that a prison is a kind of a microcosm.
Yes.
And you're seeing things about the world reflected there.
Yeah.
Now, one could say in a very blunt way, and I don't mean it, but I'll say it kind of the first thought that would come is, well, who cares what's going on in prisons? Whatever, they deserve it. Or if anything, even if they don't, in a subtle way, let's just concentrate on the real world, on children, on all people, and so on. Now, of course, I don't mean that, right? So, because of the conversation we had in Paris, and I sense, otherwise you wouldn't be studying those people, that you deeply care for them, right? So give us a sense of, well, first of all, what is a prison? If I would ask you, what is it? You know, that these are hard questions. Like if you ask a physicist, what is matter? Or a mathematician, what's a number, right? Well, what is a prison? And, well, what's going on in there? Because we see movies and it's like, you know, it's like a really horrible place. So you coming back and seeing it's a horrible place perhaps would not surprise me. And I would even say, well, who cares? So educate me on caring and not taking for granted that it has to be a horrible place.
Yeah, we're straight into the serious stuff, because for the first time, I'm writing a chapter at the end of the book on what all this means for the way we punish. And so one of the questions that you're raising is, why shouldn't prisoners suffer, right? What I would say is, well, what kind of suffering are we talking about? And there might be very destructive forms of suffering that create more violence. And then there might be, I'll grant the possibility that it's possible there are deserved forms of suffering that are to do with deprivation of liberty or trying to change people's kind of moral frameworks. And that I think what I saw happening was, and we know it was kind of going on politically, it was first of all a drastic increase in the size of the prison population, lengthening, really seriously lengthening sentences. And then what one critic would call almost turning prisoners into dead souls, which makes them very ripe for radicalization, extremist beliefs, desperate measures, violence. And this is a prison I know. And, you know, I've walked the corridors of this prison at one stage and found it. People don't know this, I don't think, who don't know prisons. But for most of my research life, prisons have actually been more full of humanity than universities.
Huh.
You wouldn't, you know, that's counterintuitive, but actually they're people, they're full of people, and people in very difficult circumstances. And for most of my research life, they've been, you know, bad in some ways, and some have been better than others. But there was always ways in which prisoners could survive, make sense of their circumstances. There were staff who did a good job. And it felt like, although they were sometimes damaging and destructive, it wasn't gratuitous. I think what I saw more recently was the consequences of a very long period of, what have I called it? Almost sadistic penal policy. And these are human beings. They're often young human beings. They're people with children. And the thing is, how I start my book is by trying to argue that prisons are the closest human beings get to death without dying, particularly in long-term high security prisons. And one of the things that happens to people who get very close to death, you know all about this, and we talked about it in Paris, is that you reevaluate your life, and you become so kind of, you're brought so close to the real and the fundamental that you start to work out what's real and fundamental. And so the tragedy is that you have people who are serving these 30-year sentences, let's say, at the age of 28. Because of the way sentencing has changed, they may not have been the person who pulled the trigger, but they happen to be in that person's address book. And so they're on a joint enterprise charge, and they go to prison and wake up and realize that actually they want to bring up their children as parents, and it's too late. And so prisons are unexpectedly quite deeply morally reflective places, where once people's chaotic lives are kind of drawn to an end, they have a lot of time to think, and they're often very kind to each other. And occasionally staff are helpful and, you know, help them to kind of move forward themselves. So you have this terrible tragedy that you have sort of the future has been taken from you, your liberty has been taken from you. But then if you also start to lose humanity and fairness and justice and the things that make it possible to live, then, you know, you're in deep trouble, and the consequences are usually violent. And so the whole question of why we punish and what it means, and making distinctions between forms of suffering that we can make morally intelligible, including to the people who are on the receiving end, versus a kind of suffering that's just, it's just careless. It's not, it doesn't have a point. It's gratuitous.
Where is it coming from, this sadism? Is it because of the regulations? Because I would suspect that the staff working there follow rules and do their best. And we're all human again. And
yeah.
But where is this leaking through? And what's making this prison life unlivable? And what could nurture? What concrete actions could be taken to nurture a better life, a more humane life in prison?
I think it is partly that people who don't go to prisons imagine that they're very powerful in our imaginations.
Yeah.
And people imagine that they're, you know, dangerous and horrible, and that the people in them are probably dangerous and horrible. But, you know, I can tell you that just isn't the case. And that, you know, as I said, I used to feel very much safer in a prison than I would feel out on a typical city street in the evening. That they're not, the people who are serving prison sentences are as complex and varied as the rest of us. And you get, you know, there are reasons why people get involved in offending. And as I try and describe in one of my chapters, that their offending is often the least of their problems. The offending is almost like a symptom of everything else, addiction or alcohol use or economic problems or all sorts of problems with relationship, problems of identity. And so my first experience of working in a prison, it was a young offender institution, to be sure, but I couldn't believe how vulnerable and fragile these young men at the time were, who were barely able to articulate to me what their experience was, and felt a lot weren't particularly forthcoming at first because they were so not used to being asked questions or being taken seriously. That I write, one of the things that's gone on in my book is, because I'm trying to synthesize, if you like, my kind of life's work and put a narrative around it. There's a methods chapter where I try and describe the evolution of my research methods. And so I tell this story that, you know, I went into prison pretty naive. I didn't know what I was going to expect.
Tell us, why did you start that in the first place? Because that's not one thing that you wake up one day and say, look, I'm going to be in a room with prison mates asking them questions, right?
Yeah. I did a master's degree. My first degree was in political science, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it. And then I ended up finding a master's degree in criminology, and I liked that because it had all my subjects in it: philosophy, psychology, sociology. It felt like this is my subject. So I did criminology. I was a bit of a SWAT, and I was at Hull University, and I got Hull University's first distinction in their MA. And because of that, my supervisor, who I knew reasonably well by that stage, in those days, you could just be invited to work on a project. And he got a project on young offenders and asked if I would like to be the research assistant. And I just said, yes, fine. And so I had to buy a car, a cheap car, drive up to somewhere in the middle of the north of England and work in a prison. I worked in 3 different institutions for 8 weeks each, and I knew nothing. I've read a few textbooks, but basically I was the research instrument, and I was given a few hints about doing some interviews. And I mean, it was amazing. It was amazing to be in this place where I was looked after by the staff who, you know, they knew I wanted to do research and they were getting people for me and helping me out. But these young prisoners were vulnerable, as I said, and fragile and familiar. And often they were in a crisis of their own. They were quite frightened. It was during the time of the short, sharp shock detention center experiment. So that, you know, the particular prison I went to first was very brisk and harsh, and they were all terrified. And so, and a researcher role is actually a really nice role because I had no power. All I had was time and interest and my notebook.
And so they were interested in you.
Yes, they were interested in me, and I wasn't on anyone's side. Well, I was on everybody's side, you could say. And my job was to just try and understand what was going on in the institution. And so, as well as doing interviews, I was able to observe things, join in with things. I did life and social skills classes, and, you know, anything that helped me immerse myself in this institution. And one of the things that I learned straight away was that if, for example, I attended an adjudication, which is when somebody gets punished for doing something wrong in a prison, I was like a witness to what was going on. And it meant if we talked afterwards, they knew I'd been in the room where they'd experienced this. And it meant I was a witness to their experience. And because of the way you put it, prisons are so removed from ordinary people that actually it's quite a privileged role. And I think it's quite an important role for staff and for prisoners who feel like nobody understands what they're experiencing. For me to be there writing everything down, the number of times people said, and you can put that in your notebook.
Please do so, right? Like make sure it counts, right? To make sure it counts.
Yes. Yeah.
Now your role as an instrument, a research instrument, as you put it, I suspect it is both objective, you know, you have your methods to write down, but tell me more about the subjective side, like, because you're coming back and these people, they're not friends, but you cultivate a relationship with them, right? So you know them, how do you integrate this? It's very interesting. And I'm thinking, and it's perhaps an unfortunate comparison, but when I used to study animals, I don't do anymore, but when I used to study other animals, non-human animals, right? Well, I always thought it's important, it's positive, it's good to also try to look through their own eyes and get to know them, not to treat them as objects. Now, here you're studying humans, of course, but well, if you were teaching your students at the university, right, about the participatory kind of instrument you are, how do you do that?
Alex, I could talk all day about
I know.
And I mean, you make me excited just asking the question. And Tim Ingold, whose book I've read, has a lot to say about this sort of thing. That I've tried to describe this in my book. I use a method I now call ethnography-led measurement, which means I get as close as I can without doing any harm, and then build any measurement comes out of that immersion. So if I'm interested in humanity as a concept, it's only possible to come up with a reliable, meaningful measure if the people who are experiencing humanity and inhumanity have provided the content for that measurement. So it's very immersed. And of course, human beings talk back. And there are some rules about research, which I try and follow them to the extent that I can, that I think are reasonable, but I do talk back. And so I give lots of examples of how in interviews, for example, not doing the kind of lofty, distant trying to be objective. You're the subject and I'm the interviewer. This is a conversation. And if I see someone struggling, so a woman, for example, who was struggling to name what she was feeling, to name the feeling she was describing, I would say to her, what you're describing sounds to me like anger. And she might say, yes, I'm angry. She didn't find the word, right? I heard it. And then I give it back to her. And she can always say, no, it's not anger, it's something else. But I'm participating in the dialogue because I'm a human being. And
do you tell them about your life?
There's restrictions on how much I'm not supposed to divulge information about where I live, or the security requirements, and I stick to those.
But I mean, you tell them, today I'm tired because
Yeah.
whatever. I mean, a very human small talk exchange that probably is very meaningful.
Yes, and they want to know, I've had some good experiences of sometimes in a team, I've had one prisoner who was quite a leader say, I'll be interviewed by the professor. I'll be interviewed by anyone else, but they want to know they can work out whether I'm tired. I mean, that's the interesting thing about prisons, is that people develop survival skills, and they can read everything. So you don't need to tell them very much, and you have to be, reasonable and kind of self-protecting about how much information you divulge. But what happens often, and I love this, is that we have a lot of informal contact. So I might run a dialogue group or do some teaching before we start to do interviews. So we attend things, get to know people, sort of break the ice. But then after an interview, you often bump into someone the next day wandering around the prison who'll say, I was thinking about what we were talking about yesterday. I was discussing it with my cellmate, and we've said, so, this is a conversation because it's about their life and experience. And prison officers do this too. They often say, if they're men, I was talking about that interview with my wife last night, because nobody else has the privilege of sitting down with them for an hour and a half, talking deeply. And so human beings participate. They're agents. They're not subjects. They're agents in research. And that's what makes it work, because that's what has to be translated into measurement. And it's only by going through those routes that I think you end up with measures that work.
Let's go back to this sadism you were pointing to. And where is it leaking from? Is it the society changes and then what, like laws change, or the people that end up in prisons are not the same kind of offenders that they used to 10 or 20 years ago? Where's the change coming from?
I mean, if people theorize about this and say that it's how governments govern, that they govern through crime and punishment more than they did, that, law and order crept up the political agenda. It used to be invisible. And in countries with very different climates, law and order is just not a political football. Whereas in our country, it's been like that for quite a long time. And it means there's a mismatch. There's a complete mismatch between the way prisons are used as a sort of political, and prisoners know this, they know that they're political instruments, and that sentencing is all about scoring points and getting votes. It's not to do with running decent institutions. And they're very astute. They know all about this because they're the people on the receiving end. And so it's really unfortunate that the way sentences have increased, it's now kind of crossed a threshold. So England and Wales have more life sentence prisoners than the whole of the rest of Western Europe put together, for example. People don't realize that. We have about 80 prisoners serving natural life sentences, which means they'll never come out. And at the same time, we're still inventing new offences that get these unbelievably dramatic prison sentences. But because the public are still...
I do think it's a triangle that's got...
Sorry, let's see. Somebody, I think I muted the person.
Okay.
Make sure you have your microphones muted, please. All right, good. Please continue, sorry.
Yeah. It's happened in lots of places. that it's partly to do with the fact that prisons are a long way from public understanding. And actually, we need more engagement. You need more people going into prisons, doing voluntary work, or meeting with prisoners, because that changes the conversation. When it's very distant, and politicians can say, we just need to be punishing offenders more, that's a very convincing political line, and that's been very damaging.
So would your assessment be that justice is becoming less just recently?
Yes, and that was, so the contrast between, let's say, the first prison one, and then I went back to it 11 years later. The first time I was there, prisoners didn't talk about their sentences very much. They talked about their life in prison, what they were doing, their relationships with staff, whereas the second time they talked about nothing else. So you could barely get them past the illegitimacy of their sentences. And that meant it almost didn't matter what the prison was doing. They were sort of not going to be persuaded that this was a morally legitimate experience. And so I could see we'd crossed a threshold, and that there's lots of different dimensions to it. But it means if we don't punish in ways that the people on the receiving end can at least grasp as a sort of just response, then they're not going to accept or comply with that sentence or learn very much from it. We're just going to make people bitter and angry. And I could see that was much more the case at time 2 than it was at time 1.
Was anger the thermometer, the main thermometer?
Yes, this is a long story, because I'll try and tell it very briefly. I diagnosed the problem as a trust paralysis, because when I looked at what was going on in the prison, it felt like nobody kind of relates to each other anymore. And it's actually taken me quite a number of years, going back to my fieldwork notes and thinking it through and reading some books, to work out that the problem was anger. Well, it was anger and distrust. And so I had to go and do a follow-up study in another prison where, in a way, anger was more overt, to work out that this was a problem of anger, that what happened in that prison was generating violence and conflict and was quite damaging and destructive. I've seen it again in another prison. And so it took me a while to work out that this was about anger.
Is your job to intervene, to make things better? No.
No, but what did happen at the time? I mean, I feel like I do feel like if my work was intended to make anything better, that has failed. It didn't for a while. So at the time when we described the prison, our report was used to prevent more money being taken out of the prison. So we were able to flag up, this is a dangerous situation, you shouldn't be making things even worse. And the report was used to prevent the prison from losing even more staff and even more money. But that didn't last very long. And that's the other thing that sort of happened in the time that I've been doing research, is that we used to have a very good dialogue with the prison service, with operational people, and there was a lot of taking seriously of empirical research findings, and that's kind of dried up a bit too, as the political agenda has become more urgent and less evidence driven.
So that's one of the reasons why you're writing the book, with the hope that somebody will read them, will read it and tell them, the politicians or whoever, can change things. Do you have that hope? Or
it's a bit less direct than that. I think I am writing the book to make sense for myself. In a way, I'm writing the book to find hope for myself that this isn't the end of the story. And so the thing I really wanted to do was find another prison that still had some of the ingredients that the first prison had. I wanted to find out for myself whether the world I had once known had gone altogether, or whether it still existed. And so I went to find 2 new high security prisons, and by some chance, the 2 were both supposed to be much better than the prison I'd returned to. One was much better. The other one was just like this paralyzed by distrust prison. And so what I now have is a comparison over time. And then I've also got a comparison in time of two prisons that each resemble the first and the second, which has been quite helpful in order to kind of puzzle out what are the dynamics here. And basically, I can now contrast, I have measured it to death, a prison that's creating violence versus a prison in which the opposite is happening. People are kind of developing and growing, becoming better moral agents. That's what I'm claiming. And there's quite a lot of evidence there. So that's enabled me. I think I was less thinking about the world of practice at the time and more thinking about what for me was a bit of an existential crisis. Is the world ended? I think I felt like this is the end of the world. If this is the world we're creating and we're switching all the lights off and everybody hates each other and projects their worst fears on each other, we've had it. And I needed to find a prison that didn't look like that to sort of convince myself. And I wanted to describe what that looks like. Yeah. Because I feel like describing it as fully as I can is my best chance of making that description available when the time comes that we work out we've got to do something better. Yes. What's the future for prisoners? Because it seems to me that they have this scar in their souls, you could say. Now, do you believe that when they come out, if they do, that they're ready to be back? And that comes back to the idea of what a prison is. Is it just a place where we put the bad guys so that they don't, create more trouble? And then we pretend that no, but we're also just helping them figure things out so it doesn't happen. But what we hear again, the usual thing is that things don't usually change. Yeah. Tell us the real deal. What's going on? As I say in my book, that hearts break and lives end in this book, and there are lots of individual stories as well as lots of data. And I have stayed friends with one or two people who've been in my various research projects, and they do leave. And one of them, I went to his wedding, and he's now living a completely nice life in another country, and keeps in touch and sends me pictures of the seaside, and so it's possible. But I also know of cases where people have come out and been found dead on a beach, that they just haven't been able to survive the transition from inside prison to outside. But when we look at this statistically, so one of the things I've done over the years is try to measure a prison's moral climate. And we've used that data to show what there is a relationship between the moral climate in a prison and what criminologists call recidivism rates, which means the frequency of reoffending when you go out. And we can show that if you look at the data globally, your chances of surviving are improved by being in one of the prisons that I'm describing that gives you a chance to grow some moral agency. It's not the end of the story, because you still have to manage the transition to life outside, where often the support falls away. But people do better in better prisons. There's no question about that. What does living there do to your mind that you can tell? You were describing these as akin to a near-death experience sometimes. Well, what happens? Other studies about kind of transformative experiences. That's a very negative one, but at the same time, it can bring a lot of light, perhaps within that darkness and that toughness, right? Exactly. What kind of transformations do you observe in some cases? Well, and let me just add one thing here that just came to mind. So I'm a great admirer, even follower of this Indian guru and poet called Sri Aurobindo, and he wrote a small book called Tales of Prison Life. He was imprisoned for something he didn't do, and in prison he had all these ultra mystical experiences. Yes. And really that's what transformed him into a political activist, to a guru and a poet and a yogi. Yeah, this is, you put your finger on, in a way, what I'm trying to show in the book, or what I found over my research life, because Dostoevsky had the same experience too. That the key is absence and presence. So what Dostoevsky says is that when the world is really dark and all you see is kind of devastation and destruction, it's the moment of kindness or humanity that is like a mystical epiphany. And you realize this is the meaning of life, right? This is what keeps people alive. And it's the contrast between the absence and presence of human values that like changes people, because they begin to realize that this is something fundamental. And that my data shows that. So I've used some material. I've done a lot of research on suicides in prison. And you might know that Albert Camus said that we know very little. It's really hard to kind of describe the moment when the mind opts for death. But because I've talked to lots of people about when the mind opts for death, and I measure moral climates, and I had a very intelligent internal prison service sponsor who said, I want to know what a survivable prison looks like. I can tell you that prisons are more survivable if they reach a certain moral threshold. And that what makes people opt for death is the lack of that moment of humanity. Like if it's that if you're in an environment, no matter how bleak, but you experience, you reverberate, the wire to the world begins to reverberate because you're in contact with this concept, humanity. You're being seen as a person. That keeps people alive. And if that's the case, the other thing that Camus said was that suicide is kind of the ultimate philosophical question. If we could answer the question of what it is that makes the difference between life being survivable and not survivable, we would have a clue to all the big philosophical questions. And that's how I framed my book. But, well, I think I've got a lot of data on the point at which the mind opts for death. And the mind opts for death when it's mute, right? It stops reverberating with other people. And when you feel that, you know, you're surrounded by indifference and contempt, that actually makes it very hard for human beings to live. And what that tells us is that all the great philosophers of the virtues who wrote in a kind of theoretical way were right. I think my data, and you know, I'm not the only person who's found this, but that's what's been propelling me, that I think I have a good argument that human souls require certain goods. And that means that value, moral value, is a phenomenon. It's a real phenomenon. It's an aspect of consciousness, and that we don't do very well without that in our worlds. And that's where we started, was that, you know, if we forget the human, we're self-destructing, that we can't exist, and that the world we're creating is kind of leaving behind or making it harder and harder to talk about concepts like soul and spirit and humanity. But those things are fundamental to how we are as beings. And that's the argument in my book, but it's full of empirical data that tries to sort of take the reader through the case.
Yeah, it's a beautiful return from the theory to the actual data and back, using prisons as a laboratory where you have these extreme conditions where you can discover, in the same way you would do it in biology in a lab, where you can discover like these rare cases, extreme cases are very telling of how we work.
Yes, and because I've got extreme cases at both ends, so that's been the sort of, I've always been interested in this method of appreciative inquiry, which I think I've talked to you about before, about making sure you focus on peak experiences. And so contrasting peak experiences with near-death experiences gives you the sort of maximum contrast. And that's what helps you to explain things and to gather data and to make sense. And so that's sort of how my research life has evolved.
Have you found differences between men and women? And also, you, a woman, talking to all these men. As I gather, you've also been in women's prisons, right?
Yeah.
Well, what are the important differences?
Yeah. The important difference is that it's very unusual for women to go to prison. So they only make up 4 or 5% of prison population. So the vast majority of people in prisons are men. And what that means is that women are extremely vulnerable. They're at an end point. They're already in an extreme category. And that the basic argument applies to women as well as to men. But what I would call imported vulnerability, the amount of trauma and sensitivity to some of the dynamics that I'm talking about are more concentrated in women's populations, because they're not just like women in general, that in order to get to prison, because you're such a sort of extreme group, you bring into prison with you even more vulnerability than you find amongst the men. So there are differences, but I've been careful to try and show that for women, the use of authority, the use of power, all of these things are just as important, if not even more concentrated, because they've often had even more extreme experiences of abuses of power outside, and they can be very distrusting, and relationships can be hard to form. So I think there's the same story for women, but it's got its own kind of concentrated dimensions.
Do you think prisons are necessary?
Yeah, this is really interesting, because I wonder whether when I finish the book, I'll be criticized by prison abolitionists who just
who by the way, maybe they've never stepped in one.
Yeah, maybe they haven't. But for me, it's frustrating. We all know, particularly in America, but other places too, that prisons have become, well, failed states, let's say. They're like failed states, and very damaging and destructive. But one of the things I do in the book is face, for the first time, some of the really difficult questions. So I'm telling myself, I wrote a book now nearly 20 years ago that started me on this trail. And I now realize I gave myself an easy time in that book, because I didn't address some really difficult questions. And one of those really difficult questions is the problem of violence, and that it's real, and that not everybody goes to prison because of poverty or social structures. That definitely structures the prison population. But there's an immediate problem of violence and risk to other human beings. And I think that has to be addressed. So I think far too many people go to prison. I think they go for far too long. I think we over rely on imprisonment and think it's a great solution when it just isn't. But at the same time, I don't think we can just abolish them. I think that's naive. And I would rather we thought much more carefully about who we think should go to prison, and then what for, and how to make them as helpful and constructive, how to make them uphold social order and repair damage rather than do even more.
How do you see the future prison? I always ask the future ...
Yeah.
How do you imagine if you could design it and instantiate it?
Well, the thing that's making me really think, and I could say is giving me hope at the moment, is that there's a crisis of staffing. People don't want to work in prisons anymore. And I have started to wonder whether that's going to do much more, that's going to have much more impact than an abolitionist argument. I think we've made prisons so destructive that it's not a good job now. And young people just don't want to do it. And that's a worldwide phenomenon, apparently. And I think that's a turning point. So there are American states where businesses are working out that it's not strategic to put all young people in prison, because you lose the workforce and it costs an awful lot of money. So there's some instrumental reasons, material reasons. But I think this staffing problem is really interesting, because I think that might force a solution, first of all, to make prisons safer, so safer for staff, and to make the work meaningful again. And I think we keep building these prisons and nobody wants to go and work in them. And that's creating havoc. So I think the problem is going to so I suppose I'm saying I don't think it's all going to continue along this path. I think we're at crisis point, and there's going to have to be some reimagining of the prison and punishment, because whatever governments want prisons to do, they just can't do them.
Yeah, we haven't talked about the staff. Thank you for bringing that back, because, well, we talked about the prisoners, you amongst them, and the world, but the staff is the buffer, and they face both worlds.
Yeah.
Have you studied them as
Yes.
part of? Yes. So what have you learned?
Well, that first study I did of the good prison was very early on in my research life, and it turned out to be a turning point. It was critical because I was looking at how staff did their work. We used appreciative inquiry, so we were asking prison officers to talk to us about their best days at work. And the study we did, it became a book called The Prison Officer. And actually, it was one of the things that made me interested in prisons, because I was so mesmerized by there's a criminal lawyer who uses a term, masterpiece. That's what he says. It's a masterpiece. When a prison officer is at the edge and is in a kind of tricky situation, but then manages to talk someone down, look, put the knife down, mate, drawing on relationships, knowledge of that prisoner, it's almost like a miracle. And it's so skilled. It's really, really skilled. And that interaction to go well requires so much understanding of human vibrations and relationships that's in a way what got me in. That I was hooked by. It's not what happens all the time by any means, but when you see it and you see one human being reaching another human being and knowing exactly what to say to calm them down, and it works, you think it's really kind of impressive and skilled, and we should value it and appreciate it and describe it and work on it.
How do they learn that?
Through experience. I mean, that's
the hard way then.
Well, some have got natural aptitude, so I don't want to sound like a dinosaur, but in the good old days, staff often used to do other jobs first. So they'd gain a lot of life experience or work experience from elsewhere and come into the prison service organization quite late in their professional lives and then learn. And a lot of officers, because I've interviewed them about this, they talk about it's like learning to drive a car. You sort of start off and you tend to follow the rules, but before long you realize you can't do the job that way, and so you have to learn to kind of take the corner. And that's what they're doing when they're gaining experience. There's a lot of evidence that staff need to reach about 3 to 4 years experience before this sort of skilled, almost, we call it practical consciousness. It's almost like a kind of instinct, like any skill, like scoring a goal in a football match or playing table tennis or whatever. It becomes second nature. So prison officers start off by saying, oh, it's all common sense. And it absolutely isn't common sense. It feels common sense to them because they learned how to do it, but it isn't common sense at all. And that if I get angry, if I've been angry in the last few years about penal policy, it's that this is not understood. And it needs to be understood, because people talk about programs in prisons and interventions and, frilly bits, but actually the fundamental task is what I'm now describing. Yeah,
the bureaucratic solution versus the art of knowing how to deal with human beings, right?
Yes.
Well, that's going to sound maybe like a very abstract question. Like, what's your position on free will? Or put it another way, people end up in prisons for many reasons, and it's complex. It's not you're a bad guy. It's like things happen and you are perhaps in the wrong place, and your upbringing and your biology. But I assume there's an element there, which is, well, I'm asking you, right? I assume, I think there's free will, and then some people really make bad choices, and that's kind of the blessing and the burden also of being a human, that you can screw it up really badly or make a great move out of your own freedom. And at the same time, prisons are the place where a great chunk of your freedom is removed as a punishment. So what have you learned about human freedom?
Yeah, it's so funny because this is the chapter that I've just finished, and I didn't know I was going to write this one. So this has a sort of it has a lot of personal investment in it. And I was trying to resist writing it for ages because I knew it would be complicated. And then one morning I just gave in and started to write it. And it's about agency. And what I'm calling it is finding the I. I have to explain that one of the frameworks I've used for this book is Martin Buber's I, it, I, thou relations. So the difference between the good and the bad prison is a bad prison is brittle and I, it, which means relationships are distant and flat. And I experience prisoners, others, as experienced objects. I know who you are and I don't bother trying to get to know you. An I, thou prison is you approach prisoners as experiencing subjects. I'm a person, you're a person. Let's get to know each other. And there's room for both intelligent trust and intelligent doubt. There's some uncertainty in the picture. And I, thou prisons are less violent. And then I suddenly realized I'd written a chapter about the I, it prison and a chapter about the I, thou prison. And I was thinking, what about the I? And what Martin Buber says, which it gets me excited even talking to you about it now, is that the I in I, it relations is different to the I in I, thou relations. The I in I, thou relations is more alive. And I've seen that happen. And so what I think is going on in the I, thou prison is that when you're treated as a thou, you become a better I, and that you find your agency. It's something that has to be developed. And that I've got lots and lots of descriptions of this, and there's prisoner biographies where they write about it. You know, I found something inside myself. Well, what is that something inside yourself? And it's almost like my own vitality, my centered self. So this is a long answer to your nice, straightforward question.
Well, actually, it feels like a short answer. I would like to hear more, but yeah, we don't have so much time. It's fascinating. I mean, I'm thinking about projection as a kind of a spark that can lead up the other person's fire of feeling human again through trust, through uncertainty and ambivalence, and
and this is what in the end my book has ended up being about suicide and what kills the life instinct, you know, what makes people devitalized. And and so my analogy now, because I've started with appreciative inquiry, is about light. That whereas for plants, you know, they grow in the direction of what gives them energy and it's light. I think for human beings, we're just the same, but our light is the deep regard of other human beings, right? In other people, think about it. I know I'm like this. If somebody looks at me with affirmation in their eyes, I grow. You know, that's what appreciative inquiry is all about. And so human beings need that light. They need other people's regard. And when that happens, they get in touch with what brings them life and energy, and then they grow in that direction. And so I can see in my I, thou prison, and prisoners describe it, they say things like, I've got my bounce back. You know, I've found my way. I've got this interest. And they start to feel energized. And so there's a sort of continuum in the book from suicide to anger, destructive kind of distress, and then to coming to life. And that's kind of what they describe. So it is related to your agency question, because I think agency and vitality are connected. And I'm ending up concluding that the good prison is providing moral opportunities to prisoners that the bad prison isn't, because this is how, when people have to grow agency in order to kind of organize and direct their own behavior and life. It's a sort of it's a kind of essential process that we should all go through in our lives, but we don't. And what I see going on in prison is versions of this going wrong and going right. And people could put it into language, you know, they see it, and they see it happening in the people around them too.
That's beautiful, because it makes me think of moral affordances, and I never put these words together in my mind before. Yes.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Well, we have a few minutes. I'd like to ask you to extrapolate. Let's extrapolate together, to kind of a copy paste and see if it works. Because because in a metaphorical way, and I think I take metaphors very seriously because they really transport us to other places. Many people live their lives outside prisons, but they live in their own prison.
Yes.
And
Yes.
this could be your couple, and you only need to spend time with a random couple to realize, oh my God, what kind of lives do people have? So
Yeah.
it could be your partner, your house,
Yeah.
can feel like a prison, your family, or even your own mind when you're because you're so depressed, let's say. And many things can feel like prisons when you're outside of prison. So how does your work illuminate the prison break in that case?
Do you know, I cried once in a group discussion with some life sentence prisoners. This was a very long time ago in the good prison, because they all assumed that everyone outside had complete freedom. And so they were talking about freedom. And it's another one of the things, you know, its meaning becomes so clear. And I was kind of silently crying to myself because there was such a distance at the time between what they were imagining and what I felt my life was like at the time. And that we all get ourselves into prisons all the time. I mean, and that's one of the things I knew that I wanted this book to help me to kind of sort out my own identity in a way. I've spent a long time looking for something. And I think what I'm looking for as I write the book is a guidance about how to live. And as you know, I had a bit of a kind of crush on Ian McGilchrist when I discovered his two books, The Matter with Things. I think I was one of the first people who bought them. And that's what sort of attracted me to the Parry Centre and your work when I saw your interview with him, because I feel like what I'm doing in my book is a small version of what he's doing in his, where he's just saying, look, this kills the life instinct, this material, mechanical, bureaucratic, risk-oriented world that's totally bureaucratic is killing our souls. And what we all yearn for, if we're kind of, you know, if we have the time to even think about it, is this other life that's got I, thou and resonance and human vibrations in it. And it's a really profound message. And I feel like I've seen a version of that playing out over time and between prisons. And so this is a book that's about much more than prisons. It is like prisons, the moral laboratory here. And it's a case study in its own right, but it's so in tune with people who are in other fields saying similar things. So Rowan Williams used the language of famine of the soul or something like that. And what prisoners use the language of desert and oasis when they talk about a good prison or a bad prison. And they're so passionate and adamant when they're in an oasis, and they contrast it with the desert. And I think the world they're describing is identical to the worlds we create outside of prisons. And so this is telling us something essential about human beings and the kind of world we need to live in.
And that's exactly how I feel now talking to you, and how I felt when we first met, and not knowing anything about prisons, or all I know is what you tell me, really. But at the same time, most, if not all, of the things you've been saying resonate so deeply with other things I know or I have experienced. So that's one of the reasons why I think your work is important and urgent, and in a way a blessing, right? Because it's helping us understand who we are as humans from these extreme confines of prison life.
Yeah, it's not what I expected to be doing with all this information.
That's good. That's a good sign too.
It's
Yeah,
that
wasn't the plan, right?
No, it
that
wasn't. Absolutely not.
All right. Well, I think we'll leave it here and open it up for comments and questions. Thank you, Alison.
Yes, if people would like to start using the raise the hand function, which they are. Veronica, would you like to join us?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 I have a new device. This is really, really
I'm so grateful that this is happening because I've been mentoring prisoners, coaching them for now about 6 years.
Oh, wow.
Prisoners, I do it through the Theosophical Society. So we have 28 courses on the spiritual life, and we do it only through correspondence. One aspect which makes it interesting is that it's totally anonymous, that they don't even know our gender.
Wow.
We know who they are and what they tell us, and more than what they tell us. To make a story short, I have a box full of their letters, and over the years, I've been through so many emotions.
Yeah.
From exhilaration to crying to having bad dreams and wonderful dreams, and their gratefulness and the work that they do where they are, unbelievable. As an example, one of them read Jean Gebser, the Ever-Present Origin. He read it 4 times. And he knows it so well that he has given lectures outside of the prison with permission.
Wow.
One of them wrote an article called Perfect Asylum. And I mention it because it's to the point of many things that you said, that it's an asylum because of the suffering that goes on there, which is most of the time uncontrollable. And perfect because the choice is to be sane or insane.
Yeah.
And once they have found that light,
Yeah.
exactly like you said, all they can do is to show that light.
Yeah.
And it's incredible what it does for the other inmates.
Yeah.
One of them is teaching yoga and meditation to them.
Yeah.
Again, as an example. Okay, to make a story short and get to my question, what I hear the most, at least in this country, and depending on which state they are incarcerated, that can change a lot in their situation. But the problems with the guards, violence and the aggressivity committed by the guards is hard to believe. Of course, I have not been to any of the prisons, but in view of their honesty and their spiritual life, I know they're telling the truth. And it's unimaginable what the guards do to them. You know, not giving them their mail, for instance, which they have no right to do their mail. To not being able to borrow a book in the library, or things that I won't mention because they're horrible. Anyway, my question is, within your research, do you think you would look into models that we would already have for better prisons? I remember Bernardo Castro in many of his talks, he mentions the prison system in the Netherlands, which apparently is one of the best in the world, because it focuses on rehabilitation and has very short sentences, even for high criminals. But then they have sort of clinics, for lack of a better word, where, you know, they could stay years and years, just making the transition that we do not have here when they have parole. And things go awry, you know, after a few months, because they cannot find a job, nobody trusts them, and it's chaos. So that was my question. Sorry for the length of my.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should I answer, Àlex, or yes?
Yes.
Thank you for all of that. There's a lot there that I would love to hear more about, and I suppose I'm not quite sure what the question was to me about how I can respond in a way that's kind of on the point. There was so much there, except that the Netherlands, like, we know that there are prison systems where things are better, that Scandinavian systems, but even they have a struggle now with public acceptability, and because of changing population demographics and people being afraid, there's pressure coming from even these populations to, there's some skepticism about liberal humanitarian penal systems. So I think there's a lot of work to be done documenting what good looks like. That's sort of what I try to do, and that includes guards and prison officer cultures. That they're quite easy to describe, and they have lots of parallels with policing cultures, for example. But then there's another job trying to shift a whole penal system from kind of culture of brutality to something that's more legitimate. And I think the best way I've found is keep describing the good and showing that it's linked to outcomes, and that's show the humanity and its impact. And that you gave lots of examples of where that's being done.
Great. Thanks so much, Veronica, and thank you, Alison. We're going to bounce around the queue a little bit, and I'm going to go to Richard. Richard Ott, please. If you would like to jump in, I will spotlight you.
A quick comment and then just a pragmatic question. The quick comment is that there's a lot of evidence that as a culture we're in decline. And when you look at recent studies comparing relatively young people, how many percentage-wise of young people think they have meaning in their lives, a study in the United States recently showed 6 out of 10 say they have no meaning. And I understand a study from Great Britain, it was even a higher number. It was like 8 out of 10 said they didn't feel they had any meaning. So it seems to me that prison can be a microcosm of what's going on in our culture. And I don't know if you specifically looked at that. On a more pragmatic level, though, studies have shown, I mean, I think it's fairly common understanding that frequently anger, especially profound anger, is a manifestation of profound sadness. And there are many studies, some of which, well, one of which I was involved with a couple decades ago, where when you did plastic surgery on prisoners who had facial deformities, and by increasing their self-esteem, tremendous difference in the recidivism when they finally got out of. So that's just a comment at a pragmatic level. But I enjoyed your comment about Ian McGilchrist, because I think his 2 volumes says it all.
Yeah, thank you. And because I have a chapter on suicide and a chapter on anger, I am very interested in the relationship. And there was less distress in the angry prison, partly because in some ways there's a lot of new literature on anger saying that it's a source of information, and that I'm arguing that we should treat it sociologically. You know, we should ask what are people angry about? It hasn't come out of nowhere. And in the same way that I think we need to ask questions about distress and measure it, I think we should do exactly the same with anger and treat it as a sociological phenomenon. Why is this prison angrier than that one? And that a lot of it is reasonable. It's not random, that it's patterned and it's telling us things. So thank you for that.
Great. Thanks so much, Richard. The next Richard Ramsey, if you would like to jump in as well.
Yes, thank you. It was really a delightful experience listening to you, partly because of my own history, starting out as the John Howard Society Prison Aftercare Group in Canada, and then 40 some odd years in suicide prevention work, and discovering that the particular program that we developed, and I don't want to go into that, but found that this idea of experiencing a renewed meaning in life was occurring both in prison training, both the custodians and the prisoners themselves in older adult care facilities, in younger treatment facilities for youth, and just in general, any one of us who gets stuck in life or entrapped or in our own prisons, there is a way to bring out that meaning and life experience again. So I've loved to learn and want to learn more and more about your work over the many years. It just brought back so many of my own memories of working in the field and now working in suicide prevention. So thank you so much for that opportunity to hear you and your lifelong work.
Thank you.
And,
thank you. That's really nice to hear. And in a way, because I've been so long writing this book, it's been nearly 4 years. I think I'm ready for like human communication. I feel like I want it out there in the world now, partly so that I can have conversations with people who are doing similar work or who have similar things to talk about. So it's nice that process it feels like it's beginning.
Yeah, and it's an experience that has spread from Canada now into countries around the world, including the UK, and so it's anyway. I'd love to have a dialogue at some point. It would be wonderful. And thank you again so much. And thank you to Perry for bringing you in as a guest, because it's such a contrast really to what maybe we often think the Perry Center will sponsor. But when you know a little bit about poem and dialogue, because that really is the whole spirit of whether it's in prison or elsewhere, it's to be able to bring dialogue into the context, so something new and or emergence can come out of it that wasn't there for either one of us. So thank you again.
Thank you, Richard.
Great. Thanks so much, Richard. And I'd like to move on to Judith, please. If you would like
Hi,
to
can you
join
hear me?
us with your
Yes.
question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So do you think Keir Starmer's handling of the recent riots was the right thing? I mean, it was amazing. I thought it was amazing that he managed to get the perpetrators in court so quickly.
The thing that I'm most impressed by with Keir Starmer is that he's appointed James Timpson to be the prisons minister, who is incredibly close to prisons and understands them. So I think who knows how it's going to turn out. But I think one of the things that's a turning point for me is that he's making really wise appointments in all posts of people who know a bit about the worlds that they're being asked to manage. So I'm not sure about the riots in particular, but I think in terms of his overall kind of political instincts, I think they're a lot better than where we've been for the last 15 years or so.
Great. Thanks so much, Alison. Thank you, Judith. If we can move on to Raymond. Raymond, we have a number of people in the queue. If we could keep the questions pointed, that would be great.
Thank you so much for Àlex and Alison for just an excellent talk. My question is about suicide. I just finished taking 2 classes reading Dostoevsky.
Oh.
And I had quite a different reaction to what I felt he was trying to say about suicide. And I'm interested in what you might have to say about it. Although we codify evil through the justice system and we try to administer laws and justice, it seemed to me Dostoevsky was saying that both evil and both good spring from within. And of course, he'd be the first one to say that the nihilism in the society of Russia at the time was the cause for many of the ways that people would act. But there's a quote from Goethe: "Two souls, alas, are housed within my breast, and each will wrestle for the mastery there." So my question is, I kept thinking, and I have a couple of personal people that I know have committed suicide. Could suicide be be the mistaken quest of what Goethe would call the good angel within, trying to extinguish or eradicate the bad angel within. I just wondered in your studies if you noticed that prisoners were divided against themselves or something like that.
That's a deep question. There's some of what you say resonates, but I don't know whether I'd put it in that language. So I think my feeling about suicide is that in prisons, obviously I know much more about it in prisons, where I think it takes on a particular dimension, and people who might not take their own lives out in the community might end up doing so in prisons. So I think it's easier to sort of control the variables and to see that there's a kind of despair, as I think I've tried to explain, that's to do with not being able to perceive any goodness in the universe or in oneself. So, you know, the world feels bleak because it's the whole kind of triad of self and other and future looks dark. So I'm not sure I would put it exactly as Dostoevsky did, but I think it's interesting to think about.
Thank you. It's very helpful.
Great. Thanks so much, Raymond. And thank you again, Alison. If Gary would like to come in with your question, we're running tight, so we've got 3 more people in the queue.
Real quickly. Hi, Alison.
Hi.
It's great to see you. I think one of the things that I've been working on here and hope to get more involved in is providing opportunities for education to those who are incarcerated. And I'm not, I'm talking about education at all possible levels, right? I mean, including completion of a high school diploma and going on to, the possibility of higher education. We're trying to link up some of our local universities with the prison system. And it seems to me that that offers a pathway of opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm very much in favor of all these kinds of initiatives, and whether it's teaching philosophy, yoga, meditation, standard curricula, education brings people to life. It's one of the most important things that can be on offer. I think anything including like arts, music, theatre, anything that is kind of puts people in touch with the human resources we all share, I think is exactly right. And it almost always works and goes down very well. So I think it sounds really exciting. I think there's a lot of work going on in this territory, and the more of it, the better.
Great. Perfect. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Alison. Hugh, we have a gentleman who's been working to find the raise a hand function. So Hugh, if you could unmute yourself and come in, that would be great. Assuming you're still there.
Yeah, I'm still here. Yes.
Great.
I just want, first of all, Alison, to honor you. I don't want to embarrass you, but it seems to me that you are embodying the essence of dialogue in your entire manner, your orientation. I think of dialogue as orientation rather than something to do with speech. And I'm just profoundly impacted, impressed by what you are radiating. I mean, that the quality of personal capacity for happiness in the face of darkness and so on is very evident, and I just want to express my appreciation of that. You wouldn't know, but I spent many years working with the chief officers of probation, and at the time we believed that probation would be the salvation of criminology, and when the Conservative government of the time amalgamated the two, I think that was one of the greatest offences to human beings. So it was just an awful time. But so I'm very conscious of the context in which you work. And for a number of years, I worked in an organization called Prison Dialogue. And I found it, I couldn't stay in it very long because I couldn't stay in the prisons very long. I felt so claustrophobic, I couldn't do the work. Personally, I found it so difficult. So I admire you all the more for the length of time and the diligence that you brought into your research. I have one last comment about Buber. I've had the privilege of putting some films together that bring Buber and Martin Buber and David Bohm together. They both use the same language, which you may not realize, of reciprocity, and many other things that bring them together. And the films, the Paris Institute has supported the creation of this film, which is still in creation. And I hope we will find a way of contacting you, because those two men reached the same conclusion. And for Paris, I think that's a very exciting time. The fact that you reference Martin Buber was a great source of satisfaction to me. But the closing remark I want to share with you is that very few people who know Martin Buber realize that his opening reference is not to people. It is to our relation with nature. Yeah. So his first image, his first reference is to a tree. And it's no accident. It's not a casual passing reference. Our relation with nature, which nobody has mentioned in this whole conversation, the impact we are having on our environment is an impact on ourselves. And we need to include that in our reference rather than see it as another subject for climate people.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
all of that. Delighted and felt very moved by the idea of these films. I can't wait to see them. So I hope.
Yeah. I will make sure they come to you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, you. Do you have time for one more question? We have a gentleman who's been waiting for a bit with David. David, if you could hop in and ask a question. We're running tight on time, but.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll be brief. First of all, I'm a psychologist, but I've also been a prisoner. My brother committed suicide as well. So I really enjoyed the depth that you brought. And I do think there's something that you're doing very right. I can't summarize that. But there was where I'm from, I'm also editor journal on eco-psychology. So I'm following on really from Hugh's point. Mm-hmm. In the dialogue, some of the things I picked up was what I would say is a slight reductiveness of the I, it, and the I, thou. For me, the kindness is not inside, it's in between. And that then relates to the cultures and environments which a prison is, and they're all very different. I was in about 3 different prisons. So I just wanted to bring that to bear as just a problem of identity and systemic relations, the very nature of a prison. So there's another area that's inside your work, and I'm happy to dialogue on it, which maybe maybe you agree with, but I felt it wasn't emphasized. And what I would see as reductive humanism at points was taken over, which I think McGilchrist does. Anyway, that's another story. Yeah. But I also thought Armory on suicide. Don't you know Jean Armory's work?
Oh, yes. Yes.
I thought that might be something to bring in, especially voluntary death and torture. Yeah. And the final remark is St. Silouan, live in hell, but do not despair. So I'm more of a pessimist, or rather, I'm more of an optimist about the gift of the darkest parts of your life. I was privileged to be with life and the evil that we made him into by perverting young boys to sleep with him is where the prison system brought out his worst. So that was all, really, if you like. Thanks so much for your piece. And I'm happy to dialogue and stuff, but that was the main thing, Jean Armory and the nature of relationship as opposed to individuation.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, David. I appreciate those comments.
Thanks. Thank you, David. Àlex, and Alison, we've reached kind of, we're 4 minutes out. Any final comments, questions, wrap up? We did have someone in the chat asking if there was a title or perhaps a time frame for
yeah.
your book to be published so that we can keep an eye out for it.
Yeah,
So,
the working title is Aristotle's Prison, A Search for Humanity and Justice. I'm hoping to finish the manuscript by the end of this year, and then there'll be a little while in the publication process, but I'm nearly at I think I'm nearly at the end. I'm ready to discuss it because I'm hoping that will help me to fine tune it.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. And if the two of you have any final closing remarks, that would be great.
Well, I'd follow up on what Hugh was saying, and I sense in you, Alison, you're this serene light, like a light that's not overly kind of happy or overly sad. It's just a very serene light amongst these dark places, including, I suppose, not just prisons, including universities. So you may very well be a university professor in danger of extinction. I don't know if there are many more like you, and so I think they're very lucky to have you there, and we've been very lucky to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Àlex, and thank you for making this happen. It's been a real privilege, and I've really appreciated the opportunity to talk to not my usual audience. It feels like this is my start of a dialogue that I feel I want to be in, and in a way it's Àlex and the Paris Centre that's got me here. So thank you all for your comments and interest and affirmation.
Thanks. Let me add one more thing that's more how I am with respect to this series, The Future Mind, and it goes in waves, and maybe it's the seasons that I follow, but sometimes we have a series of talks every month that are maybe more abstract and kind of hardcore thinking about consciousness and so on. But this one and the following conversations I'll have with Kimberly Johnson and Amy Lemon are going to be, I think, in a way, very real. I mean, we're going to be talking about birth and trauma and sex and child abuse. So I'm really looking forward to that kind of conversation topic. But at the same time, we balance it. Next week, I'm going to be discussing Flatland, this book that's 140 years old, about these geometrical figures living in 2D and and how they can tell us many things about theology and mathematics and what it means for a 2D creature to think or experience a 3D world and so on. So we go from these kind of abstractions to very concrete and important topics like the one today and the ones we will have in the coming months. And so I hope you also enjoy the harshness, the sadness, and also the reality and the light that talking about this brings, despite how uncomfortable some of these topics may be. So yeah, I wanted to reflect on what's coming.
Great. Thank you both so much. Thank you to the audience for your questions. I mean, it brings everything back into dialogue. And as Àlex mentioned, next week we'll be having Flatland. And then coming up after that, we'll be having another installation of The Future Mind, and both of which you can sign up for online. One thing to note, if you're not able to make it, we do typically send out an email with a link to the video afterwards. So that one, if you sign up and you can't make it, you should receive a link, or if you enter late. So thank you all so much. We're going to do the wave. It is always so great and so much fun. So hopefully we'll see you soon at the Paris Centre, either online or in person.
Thank you.